This discussion, with the general title Varieties of Populism and Democratic Efficacy in Europe, takes place in the context of Demos program that it is funded by the Horizon 2020 framework of the European Union. 15 institutions are participating in the research. The lead partner is the Center for Social Sciences of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And we are discussing on the occasion of Task 7.4 on how non-populist parties respond to the rise of populism. It is true that we have seen populism rise in the last decades. The financial crisis, migration, globalization, and the feeling that many people have that they have been left behind, also the rising inequalities, have made populist politicians very attractive. And maybe the most important thing of all is that at some point people stopped trusting the elites, the public institutions, including the media, government departments, and professions. Now, the big question is, how can someone convince these angry people that their lives won't get better by voting populist leaders like Trump, Salvini, Le Pen? And can mainstream media help? Can the non-populist parties do things better? Can trust be regained? We will discuss all that with Dimitri Sotiropoulos, Senior Research Fellow at ELIAMEP and Professor of Political Science at the University of Athens, and Manos Tsatsanis, Research Fellow at ELIAMEP and expert in comparative political analysis. I want to welcome you both in this podcast, in this discussion.
Hello, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation.
And to ask you both this first question, can trust really be regained? Can people trust again liberal democracy? Can they believe in the democracy as we knew it some decades ago? Why is populism so much loved by these angry people? Mr. Sotiropoulos?
This is a vital question. Indeed, there is a long-term phenomenon which we call in political science political disaffection. This is exactly a term that signifies what you have just explained. People may be angry or disappointed from political elites and political institutions. This is only one of the many different reasons for which across Europe and in other parts of the world, populist leaders have been able to obtain electoral support. And non-populist leaders, for example, leaders of mainstream parties of the right and the left, do not have ready-made answers to respond to the rise of populism. And it is very difficult indeed, in this context of political disaffection, for political parties to regain trust. In addition, we should note that there is a very long-term erosion of trust on the part of citizens towards not only political leaders, but towards many other democratic institutions. These include governments, parliaments, political parties, of course, along with public administrations, and even the European Union, which, as you know, has been a primary target of populist parties in Europe. Thus, all these institutions have a lot to do, and the first thing they may want to do is actually understand what is populism. Briefly, although there is a popular sense that populism equates demagoguery, in political science, we think that things are more complex. We believe that populism is a political ideology. It does not necessarily have the same content across different political systems in which populist parties have risen. But it is a political ideology which is based on a strong contrast. On the one hand, we have the masses, the people, so to speak, and on the other hand, we have the political elites. And in addition, in this very short understanding of what is populism from a political science perspective, we should add that this hostility between the people and the elites has also a value-laden meaning. Namely, the people are supposed to be superior to elites, and what is more scary, political institutions, such as, for instance, the ones I have just mentioned, do not necessarily become the context in which the people react. People, on the basis of this definition of populism, are superior to institutions as well. Thus, we have the usual attack of populists against constitutions and major institutions in contemporary democracies which are established by constitutions. Examples are the independent media and also the independent justice authorities.
Mr. Tsatsanis, I want to ask you now regarding my first question and what Mr. Sotiropoulos just said. One of the great political riddles of recent years is that declining trust in elites is often encouraged and exploited by figures of far more dubious moral character. I mean, there are people that they have far greater wealth sometimes than the technocrats and the politicians being ousted. So what is the cause of that? I mean, Donald Trump is very rich. Donald Trump was a person that didn't pay taxes. And although all that happened, people in the United States believed that he was better than the elites. Why?
Well, this is indeed the puzzle. How do we understand the rise of such controversial figures like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro, or other people that just a few years ago would seem crazy and really the prospect of them gaining access to the highest levels of power would seem ridiculous. However, I think that Professor Sotiropoulos is quite right to start the story from much earlier on and point towards longer-term trends that have prepared the ground for, made it possible for figures like Trump or Bolsonaro to be successful in the 21st century. You mentioned trust, and I think this is really a key concept to understand what is going on. Of course, there is a loss of trust of the citizenry towards the political elites, the elites in general, representative institutions. But as some people have pointed out, trust is a two-way street. And one, I think, of the things that mainstream actors, institutions, politicians in general can do differently, is to start also trusting the people a bit more. The approach towards the people has been at times kind of paternalistic. We're afraid to give too much voice to the people. We're afraid that they're irresponsible, and so on and so forth. My mind goes back to an already classic work that was published about a decade ago by the late Peter Mayer, the famous political scientist, where he identified in the era of globalization a growing tension between what he called responsiveness and responsibility. Responsiveness is when parties and governments respond to the short-term demands of voters and public opinion, whereas responsibility refers to the necessity to take into account the longer-term needs of the people. Now, this sounds a bit paternalistic. The elites know better what the people want, so we cede power to non-majoritarian institutions, and we take away a bit control from the political process. We depoliticize areas of decision-making. So I think this phenomenon on one level has been a reaction to this. This kind of increasing emphasis of major mainstream parties towards responsibility, which actually came to mean more and more, let's say, responsiveness towards external principles like international markets and organizations, and not towards the primary constituency, which is the people. So on the one hand, we have to look also inward and see what mainstream parties could do differently. On the other hand, I think, like Professor Sotiropoulos said, there are longer-term trends like disaffection. I think that in general, the relationship between the people and politics and political parties in particular has been changing. Membership in parties has been in decline for decades. Levels of party identification, that is the level to which a citizen, a voter identifies with the party that they vote, has been also steadily in decline across Western democracies. And this has created a political landscape that it's much more fluid, an electoral landscape that's much more volatile. So it's it's open to new political entrepreneurs that politicize niche issues, and they can come and, you know, take away power little by little away from mainstream and more established actors.
So, Mr. Sotiropoulos, you and Mr. Tsatsanis talk about populism and how we define it. Do you believe that there is a difference in the way you academics define populism and populist actors in relation to the press and the politicians themselves?
That is correct. There is such a difference. In political science, we are very skeptical towards populist leaders and populist parties. The reason is that, along with our colleagues who teach constitutional law, we are very skeptical towards the fact that populist leaders, first of all, instead of underlining the importance of institutions, they excel and illuminate the personal political skills of their own ability to resolve problems. So the first problematic element is the fact that, as Manos Tsatsanis just said, we have political entrepreneurs who do not have any remorses in using not only lies, but also in using any gaps in the constitutional protection of human rights in order to rise in power and stay in power. Except for this underlining of the personal skills of leaders who can probably resolve problems that governing elites in the past have not been able to do. A second element, which a popular but not scientific identification of what is populism puts forward, is the general condemnation of all kinds of elites, of the left, the center, and the right. And this is problematic for political scientists for the following reason. Political science, obviously, analyzing democracies, looks for pluralism. And by pluralism, we mean a set of different voices in the media, the existence of independent institutions, all the way from the justice system to independent authorities like the ombudsman, and above all, we mean different political parties which have political programs of the center, the right, and the left. All these are brushed aside by populist leaders and parties which believe that they are better in actually listening to the people, which sometimes they do, and they are even more, let's say, pretentious by claiming that they are better in resolving the problems of contemporary democracies and economies. What populist leaders miss is that contemporary problems of democracy and problems of the economy are very complex, and thus the simple-minded contrast which we find in populism, that is the contrast between us and them, and the propensity to claim that solutions are easy to find, are simply out of touch with reality.
I would like to add to what Professor Sotiropoulos said, was quite correct. Actually, our own research has identified this, or has confirmed that there is a gap between the ways that academics understand populism and non-academics. Mostly when I say non-academics, I mean the press and politicians which we interview for this project. And one of the questions is, like, before we ask them what to do about populism, how to combat it, we have to ask them, how do you understand populism? One of the good things, even though the definitions are different, is that the actors, we end up identifying the same actors. I mean, no matter how you define them, we usually, there is an overlap in the terms of the actors that we identify as populists, the political parties or the leaders. But to sum up the difference, I think even though in the academic field, the lack of consensus concerning the meaning of the term populism has been notorious in previous decades. I mean, every academic had his or her own definition of populism based on usually the experience of their own country, emphasizing different attributes. But in the past 10, 15 years, there has been a consensus among academics identifying populism as what's called an ideational phenomenon. That's a set of ideas that emphasizes a battle, that understands politics as a battle between the pure people and the corrupt elite, you know, and also giving emphasis to popular sovereignty at the expense of other liberal institutions. I think politicians have a bit, a somewhat more experiential or pedestrian, not the one that's a pedestrian, but a kind of definition of populism that does not look at ideas per se, but looks at populism as a communicative style, strategy, or approach to politics. So they talk, when we ask them to identify what makes someone or a politician or a party populist, they talk about, you know, their polarizing tone. They talk about lack of respect for political institutions, lack of knowledge, lack of interest in the process of politics. And above all, they emphasize things like overpromising, maximalism, deception, and irresponsibility. So this is really a set of stylistic things and practices and not ideas in the sense that academics have ended up defining populism.
Talking a little bit and about the people, about the voters, we talked about the economy, the financial crisis, this feeling that people have that they have been left behind. But there is also another camp that sees that a kind of revolt because of there is an expression of cultural anxiety surrounding identity and immigration. Do you think that that's also, and I'm asking that both of you, Mr. Sotiropoulos, Mr. Tsatsanis, that there is also a matter of identity, of cultural anxieties that lead people to vote for populist leaders? Mr. Sotiropoulos?
This is a very nice question, and indeed, in the past, we had a very narrow understanding of why people vote for populist parties. I will briefly explain what I mean, and Manos Tsatsanis will probably like to add more insights. So very briefly, in the past, we understood the rise of populism as an outcome of the enlargement of the numbers of people whom we call losers of globalization. These are people whose skills, I mean job skills, have become outdated, or people who have seen that their income has remained stable or even decreased because of the fact that they are in a labor market of a national economy that is not competitive in the world market. Losers of globalization, of course, can be something even more dramatic, such as people who have completely lost their jobs and are in unemployment for a long time, for instance, more than a year. But as research progressed, we know that not only losers of globalization vote for populist parties. And I will make this point again on the basis of social class and income groups. We know that in Europe, for example, exactly because we study in this research project European democracies, we have voters of populist parties in Germany who belong to the middle class, and they are also well educated. This also has happened in northern democracies, where you have voters of populist parties in Finland or Sweden who are not necessarily losers of globalization, but are people who have started understanding politics in the context of the political disaffection from democracy about which we talked already.
Mr. Tsatsanis, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I agree with Professor Sotiropoulos that the dominant explanation was the losers of modernization and later losers of globalization thesis that has been advanced again and again about the rise of these new challenger anti-establishment parties. I think that's part of the answer. Also, an answer that has been a favorite one, is, especially not on the left only, but especially on the left, that it's, you know, It's a response to the crisis of capitalism, to a period effect, let's say, of the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, that more or less reflects a rejection of the current economic status quo. I don't think that these answers are necessarily wrong, but like you said, like you suggest, capture only a part of the answer. And some people might vote for these reasons, populist parties in certain countries, but not all people vote these parties for the same reasons. And actually, even within the same voter, the rationalizing the vote can encompass both economic and cultural reasons. The economic crisis, I mean, the fact that the lower middle classes in Western democratic nations have been left behind is well documented. It's a reality. I mean, Branko Milanovic became famous for the elephant chart, where he saw the distributions of the gains from globalization in the past 3 to 4 decades. So this is certainly a reason. But how it manifests itself, I mean, someone belonging to the lower middle class might feel more vulnerable because of economic development, because of economic transformations. But then a political entrepreneur, we have also to consider the political supply side. A political entrepreneur might exploit that vulnerability, might exploit the vulnerability by taking advantage of pre-existing prejudices about immigrants, about other religions. And of course, that's when, the socioeconomic regions turn into identity politics, for example. How to disentangle between the two, it's not easy. I mean, both forces here are at play. So sum it up, I would say that both answers are correct. I see many studies that try to emphasize one or the other. I think we should look at a framework where both see how they interact, and both identity politics and socioeconomic developments can have an influence on the growth of these populist parties.
Exactly. As our host, Odin Linardatou, has mentioned, we have to take into account the fact that cultural identities are interpreted by Europeans in very different ways. So, in fact, while Europe is becoming more heterogeneous socially in terms of the types of groups of ethnic origin, religion, lifestyle, and so on and so forth, at the same time, we have the need of people to make a sense out of this transformation. It is a cultural transformation. What used to be a coherent image of society in Europe is fading away as we associate now with people from different parts of Europe as we travel throughout Europe, or we work with people from other parts of Europe. And at the same time, our societies are societies which host refugees and migrants. Thus, this long-term transformation, which has probably been accelerated over the last 10 years, creates challenges to concepts such as what is national identity, how homogeneous is a European society, and political entrepreneurs who, as Manos Tsatsanis correctly said, should be factored in this equation, supply answers which are very simple and easy. For example, shut migrants and refugees out. For example, impose straitjacket education and other policies on people who are not of the same ethnic origin as the majority of a European society. Thus, issues of cultural identity can be interpreted from different points of view of European voters. There is no easy answer to the complex problem of reconstituting the cultural identity of Europeans now that Europe has become a very heterogeneous place to live. And finally, you need to combine, as Manos Tsatsanis has suggested, personal experiences of economic hardship, for example, the downward mobility that an upper class European may experience if he or she loses part of his or her income, with this kind of uncertain cultural environment in which my imaginary European lives. That is, I think, a way to sum up the combination of economic and cultural factors.
Taking from what Mr. Sotiropoulos said, Mr. Tsatsanis, we see that in some countries in Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, and even Italy, we see that it's a normal state of affairs to have populists in the government. So, as Mr. Sotiropoulos said, do you see that there is some common patterns in the way they govern? We see that there is a common pattern against migration. They all are pro the national identity. They want less European Union. Do you see more of these patterns in these populists? I mean, between Salvini and Orban?
I think that certainly there are common patterns, both in terms of ideas as well as in terms of practices when in government. Well, in Europe, for example, in the realm of ideas, Euroscepticism has become kind of a common theme between populist parties, whether in government or in opposition. I mean, this is one of the threads that connects them. When in government, in terms of how they behave when in government, I think that also the common patterns, if we look at Hungary, if we look at Poland, if we look at Turkey, is this kind of logic that, you know, the leader of the executive is the one that expresses the general will of the people and should be as unencumbered as possible by institutional constraints to do this. So I think that the common strategy institutionally, let's say, is to remove as many obstacles as possible for the executive when exercising power. That can be by, for example, bypassing representative institutions, holding referenda, going directly to the people, holding referenda to change the constitution and remove checks and balances, remove terms in office that are in the constitutions, for example, or stacking neutral institutions with people of their own choosing in order to neutralize them. So I think these are some of the main patterns that exceed the European borders as well. I mean, we see that when populists come into power, they tend to pursue these steps more or less, even in contexts that are not non-European, in Latin America, for example, or even the United States, to some extent.
So, Mr. Sotiropoulos, back in 2019 and before the European elections, there was a lot of fear, and in the European Union and of course in the United States, that populism was going to have an even more influence in various states. But we saw that it is in a kind of retreat. Do you share that opinion? And after Mr. Sotiropoulos, Mr. Tsatsanis, I want also your view on that. We see that we saw what happened in the elections in the United States. We see what is happening in Germany. The Alternative für Deutschland, the far right, do not go so well in the polls and in the elections that they had in the various states in Germany. We see the Greens going very, very well in the polls, at least, and also in the elections in the various states. So what I mean is, do we see that this populism wave that we thought was going to come in Europe and in the United States is in retreat? Are people thinking again about voting populist parties?
That is correct. Before the European Parliament elections of 2019, there was an exaggerated fear. This was the fear that populist parties would join forces after they entered the European Parliament with a representation far higher than they had achieved in the past. None of these two fears became true. First of all, populist parties were not able to beat either the European Popular Party, which is the center-right set of parties in the European Parliament, or the Party of European Socialists, which is the set of center-left and socialist parties in parliament. And secondly, we have found out that populists have many disagreements amongst themselves. Thus, we think now that it is probably true, as you also implied, Ms. Linardatou, that people think twice before they vote for populists more than one times. The first time, indeed, one may be prone to vote for a populist party, exactly because a populist party is able to point to problems: unemployment, lack of adaptation of foreign immigrants or refugees in society, recurrent issues with corruption, and so on and so forth. So if a populist leader comes along and points to such problems, then he or she wins votes. And this is exactly the strength of the populist appeal. Namely, populists can pose the right questions. But the second time a populist leader would ask you for your vote, you would think, now that we have agreed on what are some of the lingering problems of democracy, how about discussing solutions? And as Manos Tsatsanis explained, the populist leader, upon coming to power, does not have rational solutions to such complex issues as those which we discussed. Thus, the populist leader will try to get hold of the public administration by hiring supporters of the populist party. The populist leader will try to marginalize independent voices in the mass media. The populist leader will try also to control prosecuting authorities and the justice system. But beyond that, the populist leader may perhaps resort to some old-fashioned politics of social policy, namely by allocating benefits or increases to some of the populist party's supporters. For example, pensioners, or for example, people who are voters of the populist party in the rural areas. But beyond that, beyond a typical clientelistic type of social policy, and beyond what I have just explained, namely a drive to control all other institutions in addition to the government, there is not much one would expect as a response by the populist leader to the problems that he or she himself has determined in the first place. Thus, it is the lack of answers which I think make voters not being always faithful to the populist party which they had once voted. And in this, I mean that we do have, of course, a strong base of populist parties in Italy, Poland, and Hungary, but that has to do also with the fact that we have misinformation that is spread in these populations, and we have what in the Demos research project we call lack of democratic efficacy, namely the inability up to this point of democracies to make citizens better informed and more critical towards public policies, and also with regard to the functioning of democratic institutions. So the concept of democratic efficacy, which is part of our research, indeed is very useful in understanding why, as I have just said, populist leaders are not successful in resolving problems, and secondly, the same concept of democratic efficacy could be useful in the hands of non-populist leaders who would like to put together a good strategy to counter populism.
Mr. Tsatsanis, do you want to comment on that, and then maybe talk also about what are exactly the main strategies, if they are employed by the mainstream and centrist actors? What do you find in your own research? We heard what Mr. Sotiropoulos said about the strategies, but are there also more strategies?
Well, yes, first of all, I agree with what Professor Sotiropoulos said. To his point, I think that one of the reasons why populist wave did not materialize, it was much tamer than expected, has to do with the fact that, populists to some extent were victims of their own success. When they did manage to enter government, as many people predicted, the maximalist agendas that they brought into their office were not materialized. They found that the burdens of governance are not so easily manageable, so they weren't able to drain the swamp so easily, for example, as Trump had promised. So for this reason, I guess to some extent, the governance experience of populists kind of discredited their brand of politics among the different national electorates. However, there is some talk after this kind of the populist wave fizzled out in 2019. Certain people talked about the defeat of populism, a return to normality. I think that many of the underlying conditions that brought populists in power in the first place are still there, and they haven't been addressed. I think the relationship, first of all, the relationship of citizens with political parties has fundamentally changed, and there is a very strong generational component to this. Younger people do not relate to political parties and are not as loyal as their parents, or even less in relation to their grandparents. So there is always the political opportunity structure for either the old populist parties to return, or in this volatile electoral environment for new parties, new niche parties to politicize new issues, so we can see further earthquake elections in the future. So I'm not as optimistic about, some people calling a final defeat of populism. Now, about your other question, in our own research, we have tried to see how mainstream actors, which can, again, the definition of what constitutes a mainstream actor is part of a wider debate, but let's not waste time on this right now. How they have been able, or how they have attempted to address the rise of challengers. In the literature and within our own work, there are four main strategies that have emerged. One is what is called a dismissive strategy, which is to simply ignore the policies of populist actors. A second strategy is to actively oppose, isolate populists, what we call a confrontational strategy. Third strategy is to converge towards populists in terms of policies, to co-opt populist policies. And finally, the last step is to collaborate. Now, there is no fixed sequence in terms of these strategies. In each country, there have been different mix of strategies that change over time, but we have observed that in most cases, mainstream actors start with a dismissive strategy, and as populist actors and the issues that have brought into the political system and the party system gain salience, they start resorting into the next strategies, either confrontation or co-optation. The best example of co-optation would be the Conservative Party and how it co-opted the agenda of UKIP, for example, after years of ignoring the party and Nigel Farage, or ridiculing even Cameron himself 15 years ago was talking about Farage and UKIP as a bunch of clowns, but ended up adopting many of the proposals about the European Union, or even collaborating with them, which we saw that in some cases is the most successful strategy. For example, bringing populist actors into government can be the best way to neutralizing them. We saw this, for instance, in Portugal, where the Socialist Party managed to forge a coalition, a minority government in collaboration with Bloco de Esquerda, which is classified usually as a populist party, and also the Communist Party. And we saw that this, to some extent, had the effect of boosting the popularity of the socialists and limiting the appeal of the two minor parties.
So we talked a lot about politicians on either side. As we are nearing the end of our discussion, how can media can media play a crucial role? Because we see in a populist environment that also mainstream media, the good newspapers like New York Times or Washington Post or Guardian are being attacked by the populist leaders. So is there a strategy that also the media can use against populism, and so that they will become again in the eyes of the people, of the voters, as their main way of getting the right information and the truth of what is happening?
One could answer this question by saying that the media indeed have a positive role to play if they combine two strategies. One would be for media themselves to become more humble than they are today. And the second being media using all the professionalism which is available among their journalists in order to be more persistent and more precise. The first thing, which is to become more humble, has to do with the fact that readers of newspapers or those who follow news on TV sometimes have the impression that the media is able to first precisely describe exactly what is, for instance, an economic crisis, and secondly, to interpret it plausibly as well. That is not true. Media must be able, I submit to you, to present situations as more nuanced and more complex than it is usually done, even though I realize the TV time or the radio time does not allow for long-term explanations. As for persistence and precision, which was my second point, I would like to say that it is because of the professionalism and insistence of journalists that populist leaders have lost part of their clout. It is journalists who have used their skills to unearth false impressions, to strike down fake news, to explain that populist leaders have been furnishing fabricated data. And by doing this, by being persistent and precise, journalists have been able on various occasions to show that the populist programs may be shallow after all. So while we usually blame the media, and by this I mean not only the traditional media, but also the social media, for the rise of populism, I think that we have in our hands, by which I mean democracies have in their hands, a powerful weapon against populism. And to repeat and sum it up, this is a two-pronged weapon, namely media which is more humble, media which is persistent and precise.
Mr. Tsatsanis?
I completely agree. I mean, professionalism is one of the main tools with which, media itself will regain credibility and will be actually a tool of political education that is one of the best ways to combat populism, in my opinion. Even though, of course, the media landscape is far from homogeneous, the culpability is not equally shared within the media community in different countries. But also, I think one of the dangers is that there is a media model that has been, has been gaining momentum, which kind of feeds on polarization, feeds polarization itself. For polarization, we see that in the United States, which is a pioneer in these things, provides a good business model for the media, right? It brings ratings. So why rest on, let's say, long, inquisitive kind of reporting when we can have just talking heads shouting at each other and taking sides? The media itself has been taking sides often enough, even well-established and reputable institutions. I think to some extent, maybe some people disagree. I think we saw this in the United States to some extent. In the fight against populism, I think some of the most reputable institutions kind of jettisoned some of their own principles, their own journalistic principles aside in the fight to bring down Trump. I think the whole Russia collusion incident was one example where the media jumped upon this issue without doing really its due diligence, and it kind of backfired. And it kind of backfired in the sense that people on the other side saw this as more proof that the media is fake news, and used it as a weapon in Trump's propaganda mill. So I think the media has to do a better job, has to return to its own core principles. Due diligence is one of the things, and try to be as objective as possible. Objectivity is one of the things that, if we talk about European countries like Greece, it's hard to find nowadays. One feels a media outlet where one can find true objective news reporting. It all seems filtered through someone's view, and true objectivity seems to be in retreat, in my opinion.
Professor Sotiropoulos, Mr. Tsatsanis, I thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.